part of the Earglue Media family of podcasts.
You're listening to Petticoats and Poppies.
History Girls at the Movies.
Welcome to Petticoats and Poppies, History Girls at the Movies. We're your hosts, Maggie and
Nicole.
Welcome to our 36th episode and our second Friendsgiving episode of the year. Today we will be talking about the 1940 film, The Great Dictator.
In our last episode, we had Adam Lance Garcia on to discuss Little Women, and today we have our second guest for Friendsgiving. And we also have someone who presents a very exciting first for Petticoats and Poppies, which is our first guest who actually has a history degree. He is a fantastic film critic, co-founder of Music City Drive-In, and also a good friend of ours, Jacob Throneberry. Thank you so much for coming on, Jacob.
Hi. Thanks for having me. Yep, I've listened to a few of them.
Excellent.
And I really like this podcast, and I'm excited to be on and talk about one of my favorite movies.
Awesome. Well, to start out, we're just going to let our listeners get to know you a little bit. So our first question that we like to ask our guests is, what is one topic in history that you're very interested in?
So my favorite topic in history was Vietnam. That's what I did my full seminar paper on. I've taught classes on Vietnam. I have done speakings on Vietnam and actually a lot of Vietnam film, PTSD, all that kind of stuff. That's kind of what I've more geared towards going through college.
Excellent. So what are some of your favorite films? They don't have to be historical films yet. We'll get to that question next.
Some of my favorites, 8th grade. That's my all-time favorite. The Truman Show, Rocky, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. That's
a classic.
Yeah, absolutely one of my favorites. I'm trying to think of some that are not.
It really puts you on the spot, right?
Yeah.
I love Punch Drunk Love, which shout out for PTA because I'm super excited for Licorice Pizza. Nashville, American Graffiti, basically those are a lot of them.
Awesome. And so then to ask the other side of that, what are some of your favorite period films?
So The Great Dictator, period films.
I feel like we've made you forget every period film you've ever seen in this moment.
There's been a few recent ones out in theaters. Did any of those strike your fancy?
I will say, I've told this to Nicole, I do love Little Women, but I wanted to not love it when it first came out.
Oh, Jacob.
I really didn't want it to be good, but I do love it.
You were a big 1917 fan, weren't you?
I was. I just saw The Tragedy of Macbeth and loved that. What else?
Oh, what was the other? Dunkirk. Did you like Dunkirk?
Oh yeah. I love Dunkirk. Amadeus.
Mm-hmm.
That's one
I was trying to think. I was like, there's one that you keep telling me to watch, and I couldn't think of what it was. That's what it is.
I love Amadeus. 12 Years a Slave is just incredible. I did many papers on that. I'm like trying to look through my letterbox while I'm like answering these questions.
I do that thing where as soon as somebody asks me anything about my favorite films, I'm like, I've never seen a movie in my entire life.
Let me find one single more. I'll just go with Deer Hunter since I said Vietnam.
Okay, I truly was like, are you not going to give us a Vietnam movie after you said all of that?
Yeah, I'll go with Deer Hunter.
Excellent. Well, our next question should be an easy one to answer. What made you choose The Great Dictator to talk about today on the podcast?
So I studied The Great Dictator for a little bit in college, in some of my film classes. I really love just kind of the story it tells. I love what Charlie Chaplin did. I love how kind of innovative he was just to film in general, but how he used his classic kind of take on, what he did well and was able to use that in a comedic and super dramatic way for this film. And it's a film that, and I know we'll talk about this, it's a film that is still very relevant for a lot of it to today. And I think it's important, especially, and I know we'll talk about this, the big speech at the end, which still is like, I mean, it's just as important now as it was back in 1940.
I agree.
Awesome.
And I guess for our listeners who haven't had the opportunity to see The Great Dictator or are not aware of it, we'll give a little bit of information about that before we get into opinions on the film. As we have said, it came out in 1940. It is an American satirical comedy drama. It was written, directed, produced, scored, and starring Charlie Chaplin. It was Chaplin's first true sound film, or as I think all of us referenced in our notes, a talkie. The film is a satirical telling about Adolf Hitler, Mussolini, fascism, and Nazis. It was released at a time when the U.S. was not yet in the war. Charlie Chaplin played both the fascist dictator, Hinkle, and the Jewish barber. This is Chaplin's most commercially successful film. Considered one of the greatest comedies ever made, it was selected for preservation by the National Film Registry in 1997. It was nominated for 5 Oscars, including Outstanding Production, Best Actor, Best Writing for an Original Screenplay, Best Supporting Actor, and Best Music and Original Score. This is the perfect time to talk about this movie because The Real Charlie Chaplin, a new documentary about the comedian, is coming out this year.
I actually just got my screener in the mail for it the other day, and
Oh,
I
excellent.
was like, "Oh hey, good timing." I definitely want to check that out, especially like after watching The Great Dictator. I'm interested to learn more about Chaplin. But okay, so thoughts on the movie. I was super excited whenever Jacob suggested this one because, first of all, I really want to talk about more like older movies on the podcast because I'm a big like black and white film junkie. But also because I'd seen this in bits and pieces in classes in high school, but I'd never watched it like all the way through before. And I absolutely love this movie. I really love that first section that is depicting like World War One early on. Listeners might remember I'm like a huge World War One nerd, so I like anytime I get to see that in film. But also I'm so fascinated by the fact that this film was made in 1940, and like we'll talk more about that later and what that means exactly. But the fact that Chaplin sort of had this this vision, I think, and this foresight to make this movie at a time when Hitler was still sort of rising to power, and the world wasn't like the US wasn't like fully engaged in all of it yet, I think is really interesting. But this film, like the production design on this movie, incredible. The physical comedy in this movie, top notch. Like Chaplin is such a fun actor to watch, I think. Like that scene with the globe is so fun. I love hearing because like I feel like typically in movies about the Nazis, they use the German words for everything. So to actually hear them say the word stormtroopers like really cracked me up. Because obviously like that's where like George Lucas was inspired by and whatever, but I feel like typically nowadays whenever they make films about Nazi Germany, they're always like throwing in the German names for everything so that they're not saying that. But I also love the fact that this movie like has a freaking transformation scene where they like take the washerwoman or whatever she is and transform her into a beautiful woman. That really was not something I expected from this. But and obviously like that big speech at the end is fantastic. But I have to say watching this made me really want to watch the new Chaplin documentary, and it also made me want to go back and watch that Chaplin movie with Robert Downey Jr. Because I think that Chaplin's like a really fascinating figure in film history, and he's obviously like a brilliant comedian, but also sort of seeing this and seeing the way that he's also like a political satirist, I think is really interesting. And also as someone who is a huge fan, I know not everyone is, but as a huge fan of the movie Jojo Rabbit, I really am fascinated by sort of seeing that there is this history that goes all the way back to 1940. And I know this was something that was talked about a lot whenever Jojo Rabbit came out. This sort of continued tradition of depicting Hitler in this sort of satirical, comical way, I think is like a really interesting legacy throughout film as people have sort of figured out how to deal with the depiction of an evil such as that and what you can do to satirize it. So Yeah, I was really excited about this movie.
Yeah, so, you bring up Jojo Rabbit. That actually was one of the first things I said after leaving Jojo Rabbit. I just told everyone, I said, hey, go watch The Great Dictator instead.
I know this. We do
Um,
not agree on this movie. It's fine.
yeah. Um, but anyways,
You were
yeah,
doing so well, Jacob.
I know. I know.
I know. I
Eject
don't know
from
what it was.
StreamYard.
There's like 2 or 3 movies I've ever fallen asleep in the theater, and that was one of them. It was that, Spectre, I think, was the bad James Bond, and the newest Indiana Jones, The Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. Those are the 3.
Everybody has to have faults. It's okay.
It's okay. We'll let you stay on this episode.
Yeah, it's the last one.
Yeah.
They're like, come off. No, but I do think it's really interesting. And I think it's interesting a lot kind of behind the scenes of like why he took this project on, because there were a lot of people in, like you said, Charlie Chaplin, amazing comedian, but there are a lot of people like, Laurel and Hardy and people like that who made movies for the sake of comedy, where Charlie Chaplin was more, I mean, he was a big humanitarian and he made movies because he wanted to actually say something, which is like really important and kind of um, like mind blowing for of the time. But I think it is interesting because like not only does Chaplin always resembled Hitler, they were born 4 days apart. He's 4 days older than him, same year, same month. Um, and he kind of just used that whole story of looking like him to his advantage in this movie, which I thought was um, really fascinating. I mean, he puts in the beginning, he says any resemblance between the Jewish barber and Hinkle is coincidental, not coincidental, but he very like very on the nose puts a dash in between it. And he doesn't, he just says them, which I think is again just really cool. I think, like I said earlier, I think he really, because like we've all said, it's his first talkie, but he really brought like the silent aspect into the talkie. In the very beginning, like you said, with World War I, when it had the shell spinning around. I mean, that's a very like silent era type of comedy that worked in this. And I think one of my favorite parts was when he ran in to talk to the captain, and he started like doing all these hand motions to try to tell that the stormtroopers were coming. And Hannah, the washer, comes in and she was like, "Did you tell him?" And he just like falls over and just says yes. And I think that's like the perfect blend of like the silent comedy, like using talkies to pull the silent comedy out, which I thought was really interesting. And it's like you said, it's in a time where we weren't in the war yet,
Mm-hmm.
and I think we were very much trying to stay out of the war. And he didn't make an attack on like on Nazi Germany or on like the whole thing, like the thing as a whole. He made a very like direct attack on the leader in a time where we weren't in the war, which is just kind of insane to think about. Like you said, it's his most commercial film, and it almost wasn't even released in America or England, and it wasn't released in most of the world. And I guess the last thing is I was doing like some research, and I think it's really cool that he writes in his autobiography. He says, "To me, the funniest thing in the world is to ridicule imposters, and it would be hard to find a bigger imposter than Hitler." And I just think he really is he's much more than a comedian. He's wanting to tell a message and tell a story. And I think especially in 1940, at the height of Hitler's, regime, just incredible.
Yeah, I would agree. I think we already mentioned it briefly, but the speech at the end was incredibly relevant, tragically so I was not expecting that, because it was like he literally is staring directly at the camera. I was like, hey, we should not be letting these things happen. Just super timely. But I think this was the first time I have ever seen a Charlie Chaplin movie. I know I've seen like bits and pieces particularly when I took film classes at community college. But it was really intriguing to watch. I've seen like Laurel and Hardy style like silent comedy and stuff, but to see his first full talkie was very fun. I was really impressed in that entire like opening World War I sequence. I really loved the big guns. I thought that was like very cool, and like I know that the guns are large in real life, but those are obviously like over dramatized sizing, which made it just seem so funny when he was doing that very physical comedy. And I also thought it was interesting how they used this setup that was really, I don't want to say common because like all silent films were not this way, but that specific style of storytelling from silent films was very present in that opening scene. And I think a lot of that was because they were trying to be like, okay, you're used to silent films, but here is the same style of story with some words thrown in, because that whole opening sequence is fairly quiet. Only those main little like, go get this, go do this, like dialogue. And I thought that was really interesting how they used a lot of the silent film tropes, but carried it through to a talkie. I was also really impressed by the painted backdrops, particularly in the last scene when Hannah like hears the speech or whatever. The background on that is like very obviously a painted backdrop, but only if you look really close do you see that, because it's so intricately done. And I think a lot of that artistry is lost now that we have a lot of digital things, and we have things like what Lucasfilm has created with the blanking on the name of it, but the digital screen that you can create stuff. Yeah. I'm totally blanking on the name of this.
God, I've even discussed this at work.
Oh, I've frequently had tangents about this, and it's just like escaping my brain right now.
Yeah.
It's one of those days.
It's the using the
digital
CGI
CGI digital, like real time digital. It changes something about how classic films, like when you revisit them and you see how much artistry went into making these. And that's not saying modern day films lack artistry or anything. I'm just saying that like there's a different style that's brought forward that I think is really endearing and very charming, because it I don't know, it's something I really fixated on watching this, because I love that style of old Hollywood, how these productions were made. I was like really amused by the clever plays on words and like code names he used, like adenoid hinkle, Tomania, bacteria, garbage, phooey, very, very comical. I also thought that it was funny how he just made up fake German words, and also like schnitzel.
The German, like the fake German going on in it is incredible.
It's so funny. Go ahead.
There was because I watched it with subtitles on, and it would be like they're just saying fake German, and then it would just say banana on the bottom of the screen.
Yeah, it's so funny too, because like I know German, I know enough German that I could hear like the actual German words he was saying, and my brain was like, it's this word, but then it was like just random
in a mass of just like sounds. Yeah,
like ick. I'm like, okay, you're saying I 10 times to get like the German guttural thing going.
Yeah,
that was singularly hilarious to me. I will say I'm not like a huge fan of physical comedy, and there's like certain things that Charlie Chaplin does that I know is like very indicative of the time period and like the style of physical comedy, but like the way that he does the stumble thing, like his specific style of stumbling, like I found kind of overdone in this particular film. Like it was done a lot, and I was like, okay, I get it. It's like the 1-2 step stumble thing. But like it worked. It just felt like it was done a lot in like one particular sequence. And of course, I love the scaffolding scene. I think that was like the one scene that I had seen before where he keeps dropping the bags and then like takes the can or whatever off of his head, the pail, and is like, oh, I thought that was really funny. But yeah, I really enjoyed it. I wished it wasn't 2 hours long, but that's fine.
Yeah. You texted me that, and I was like, you're such a TV person.
I am such a TV person, but also like I like historical films that are like around that like hour 45 mark. I feel like 2 hours, and then it's just like, okay, I'm getting antsy. It's ADHD, a little too much commitment.
I'm not laughing at your ADHD. I'm laughing at how often I've heard you say this.
It's a problem. I'm aware of it. I have to psych myself up for movies that are longer than 2 hours. But yeah, and now I get to talk about Charlie Chaplin, and I totally like derailed my own research because I got like fixated on something.
Isn't that how this always works?
Yeah,
That's the point of this podcast.
And I feel kind of bad because it kind of paints Chaplin in a slightly bad light, but we'll get through it. We'll get through it. Go. Okay. So Charlie Chaplin was born on April 16th, 1889. As we mentioned, he was born in London, England, and it makes so much sense to me that he was an Aries.
I'm gonna cry.
It just makes so much. I actually added that just for you, Nicole.
I figured that was for me.
100% for you. Okay, so his parents were both creatives. His father was a vocalist and an actor, as was his mother. Unfortunately, his father was also an alcoholic, and he abandoned his family not long after Charlie was born. His mother went by the stage name of Lily Harley. His mother would unfortunately eventually be committed to an asylum for mental illness. And because of this, Charlie and his older half-brother, Sidney, did work in the London workhouses to support his family. There was a period of time where his mother, she was a vaudeville singer and performer. And when he was around 5 years old, she was on stage singing and she lost her voice. And allegedly, her manager pushed Charlie out onto stage to pick up the act. And he like charmed all of the audiences and like he carried on the performance for that night. But his mother's voice never fully recovered from whatever happened to cause this vocal incident. And that caused them to kind of like fall into poverty. That was when he like got it. So when he was 5 was when he got his first taste of performance. He went on to work as a children's dancer in a dance troupe before making his mark on the big screen. In 1914, Charlie made his film debut in in a somewhat forgettable one-reeler called Make a Living. To differentiate himself from all of the other actors at the time in this style of film, he decided to play a single identifiable character, which is the Little Tramp. And this was when the Little Tramp was born. And this is the bowler hat, the whole look that Charlie Chaplin is known for, was born at this point. And yeah, he went on to make so many films. I was going to like list all the films he was in and I was like, no, that's too many. Too many. He made 35 in 1 year. So very robust career. When I was researching this, I was really shocked to see how many times he'd been married, both like shocked and not surprised at the same time, just because I am aware that there's a lot of fraternity stuff with him. Like he had lots of mistresses and affairs, and like there's a lot of Chaplin heirs running around, apparently. And I felt like I'd be remiss not to mention, if I didn't mention that he seemed to have an interest in marrying very young women. And obviously, like I always say this, like I am aware that times were different then. Like women got married very young. But when he was 26, he married 16-year-old Mildred Harris. The marriage only lasted 2 years. When he was 35, he married another 16-year-old, this time Leda Gray. They divorced just 3 years after she had given birth to 2 sons. One of which was actually the reason that they got married in the first place. When she was 16, she got pregnant filming The Gold Rush, where she was performing with Chaplin, and that's why they ended up getting married. And then when he was 54, he married 18-year-old Ona. I think that's how you say her name, Ona O'Neill, who is Eugene O'Neill's daughter. He met her when she was 17. And he was looking for a lead actress in a movie that he was casting. And her family was like, hey, what about her? And he actually didn't cast her for that film. He used her in something else and then got married. And they actually had 8 children together. And that was who he was married to until his death.
There's the line in When Harry Met Sally about like Charlie Chaplin had a kid when he was 73. Like...
Yeah. And in between that, he also married, I forgot to mention this in my notes about watching the movie, but he married Paulette
Goddard.
Goddard, who plays Hannah in The Great Dictator.
Here's a very fun thing about her, though, which I was very excited when I found this out. Sorry to like overtake this. But she was married to Chaplin whenever they made this movie. She'd been married once before, and she was married twice after. Her last husband, though, was Eric Maria Remarque. I think that's how you say it, who was the author of All Quiet on the Western Front.
Yes.
Which that is one of my favorite novels. So I was very excited to find that out.
Her divorce with Chaplin was very interesting as well, because she got divorced, they got together, they married in secret, they were together, I think 5 years. I might be wrong. It might be 4 years. They weren't together very long, but she ended up getting a Mexican divorce. So they went to Mexico to get divorced. Yeah, it's a thing that was really popular apparently with like Hollywood types during this era, because it was super cheap and like you didn't lose any property if you went to Mexico to get divorced. And then she married somebody like a year later. I don't know. I just thought his like interpersonal relationships were really interesting. And I was like, I know that women got married much younger because families were like, here, take my daughter, so I have one less like mouth to feed. But I just thought it was not cool. Like, as somebody in the acting industry who like is very aware of the similar predatory things that are still happening today, I just thought it was a little sketchy that every leading lady that he was with, he married, and especially the young ones.
Ooh.
You know, never look too closely at people's favorite performers.
Yeah.
Especially from a certain era in Hollywood.
Yeah, no kidding.
But he did, you know, he had a very vibrant career. In 1972, he was given an honorary Academy Award. It was given to him the same year that I believe his final film, was out in theaters, and that film actually like completely like did not do well. It was a flop. And that was actually the last time that he visited America. In 1975, Chaplin was knighted by Queen Elizabeth II, and he died in Switzerland on Christmas Day in 1977 at the age of 88.
Damn. All right, dude.
Yes.
Not bad.
That's a little quick overview.
I'm going to go ahead and jump in then and do my spiel real quick. So I was on the Wikipedia page for this movie.
Oh, no.
As one does. And I was reading all this stuff about the production, and I got really interested in the fact that supposedly Chaplin was very inspired for his performance in this in particular, but for the film as a whole as well, by the movie Triumph of the Will, which was a film by, and I feel like I'm going to butcher this name, but Lenny Riefenstahl, who is still actually, fun fact, one of the most taught female directors, which is terrifying. So basically, in Jürgen Trimborn's biography of Lenny Riefenstahl, he says that Chaplin saw a screening of Triumph of the Will at the New York City Museum of Modern Art, and supposedly everyone that he was with was like kind of horrified by it, but he laughed at it a lot and thought it was really funny, even though it wasn't meant to be. And he was inspired to make The Great Dictator, and to sort of shape this movie that he'd been wanting to make about Hitler, because he wanted to sort of do something to criticize Hitler and to play off of the fact that they did look very similar. And so he watched both this documentary a lot and also newsreels repeatedly to learn how to like mimic Hitler's mannerisms and his oratory style as well. But so Triumph of the Will came out in 1935, and it is a documentary that's a little under 2 hours long. Sorry, Maggie, it's not shorter than that. Although I did look, you can rent it on Amazon, which is interesting because it's straight up Nazi propaganda. It was made about, like, it's a documentary of the 1934 Nazi Party Congress and the rally in Nuremberg. And it's considered one of the most, like, important documentaries ever made from a historical perspective, as it's thought to be, like, the most effective piece of Nazi propaganda. Modern reviews, because I did find some reviews that people have written in, like, recent years, and they vary on whether or not they think it's, like, actually a good documentary. But it is certainly an important documentary. But Lenny Riefenstahl was a dancer and an actress before she made her directorial debut in 1932 with a film called The Blue Light. And she made a number of documentaries and was very affiliated with the Nazi Party. And after the war, she tried to say that she was just, like, really committed to filmmaking. But, like, it's fairly clear that she actually was a Nazi. And that it wasn't, like, she was kind of lying about that. But in any case, they sent her to Nuremberg 5 months before this Congress that they were holding, to let her like set up for everything, because she'd previously documented the first Nazi Party Congress in 1933 with a film called Victory of the Faith. But Hitler and his minister of propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, is that it? Goebbels? Really admired her work. They were huge fans of hers, and they gave her like unlimited resources to make this documentary. She literally constructed like bridges and towers and all these things to just like put her cameras on while this event was happening. And so they actually like structured the Congress in a way to make her filmmaking easier. So they had a lot of like parades of different troops and different stuff going by for Hitler, like review or whatever. And they actually like did all the routes and stuff in ways that would make it easy for her to film them. And the opening titles to this frame Hitler as this like savior who has come to begin the German rebirth. And the film notably has like a bunch of speeches from different people, and infantry, cavalry, artillery like marching past Hitler for him to like look at or whatever. But it has 2 speeches of Hitler's, and so like it's partially important because of the way they had documented that, and that's what like Chaplin really used this to learn like about like Nazi sort of how they did things in general, and especially because we see a lot of soldiers obviously in The Great Dictator, but also particularly to study Hitler's oratory style. But she had like these huge crowds of like Aryan masses brought in, of these like blonde people to look nice in it, and there's a lot of Nazi imagery, a lot of swastikas, that sort of stuff. And it was meant to both like rouse Nazi support within Germany, but also like impress other countries with Nazi power, to be like, ooh, look at how many soldiers we have. And the film was screened in the United States, the United Kingdom, and other like non-German countries, which I think is just very interesting to think about, the fact that in 1935 like Charlie Chaplin went to the MoMA in New York City to watch a Nazi propaganda movie. And in response to it, though, the US government actually commissioned Hollywood director Frank Capra to make American propaganda films based on Triumph of the Will, to like use that like sort of methodology to like try to make American propaganda as well. And there's like the 7-film series. It's called Why We Fight. But I just thought that was really interesting that he sort of studied this documentary to learn how to mimic Hitler better. But also I'm just fascinated by the fact that like Lenny Riefenstahl is still considered one of the most important female directors ever made, and she like definitely was a Nazi. And I don't really think that that's been like fully reckoned with, maybe because we're still teaching her in schools. But also just that like this documentary was just like straight up screened like in the US, even though it is nothing but propaganda. And I don't know, I'm very fascinated with film in the 1940s and the ways that it was used as propaganda. Like there's that Maggie, I don't know if you've ever seen the Pride and Prejudice that was made in the 40s with Laurence Olivier. Yeah. How
could I have not seen this?
I figured you had, but it is a straight up piece of propaganda that they made because they were like, we need to convince Americans that the Brits are really cool and they are our friends and we should go to war with them.
Hey, I mean, it worked.
I mean, like, it worked. Like, I guess they were like, we need everyone
we think
to be,
the Brits are cool still.
Go to war for Laurence Olivier. Do it for Laurence Olivier. I'm losing my train of thought now. But in any case, I thought that, like, I wanted to also just sort of discuss the fact that, like, the time in which this film was made, because I think that that's, like, maybe the most... I feel like I don't want to say like we don't get films like this anymore, but I think that like most people aren't aware of the fact that like Chaplin was out here calling out Hitler in 1940.
Yeah, that's the biggest thing. And I think it is interesting, like you said, because we don't have, you see it in little pieces, especially with films like The Black Klansman, like that scene at the end, that like direct call out.
Still makes me cry every time I see that.
Yep. I love that movie.
But it is interesting how sparse it is to actually like attack. And that's one of the biggest things that I mentioned earlier. It's he didn't just attack Nazi Germany. He wasn't like, oh, this is a bad thing happening over there. He just kind of like went straight for the people in charge, and he did it in such a comedic way. He did it in such a way where he said, and this was like, I mean, everyone knew, seemingly knew what was happening, but he said, he said, had I known the actual horrors of the German concentration camps, I could not have made The Great Dictator. So he did it before he even really knew how bad everything was getting. And I think his kind of take on the leaders were really funny. The food fight scene in particular, the scene where he's dancing around with the globe, it makes them all seem kind of like children who kind of got into this position, rather than actual people who knew how to lead, which is smart in my opinion. And like I said earlier, he was very worried. Him and the studio were very worried that this film wasn't going to get made. Germany banned it. No one in Germany had seen it until I think 1958 was when Germany first started showing it. Stalin, who was a huge fan of Charlie Chaplin, I'm pretty sure he even like cried at the end of one of his films. He completely banned this film, which there is like, if you dive into it, there is like this weird relationship between Chaplin and Stalin. And if I remember correctly, I don't have any of my sites because, sorry, but if I remember correctly, I'm pretty sure that Chaplin at one point thought that Joseph Stalin would have been the only person who could have defeated Hitler, just in the war. But so there were still issues with if it was going to be able to be screened in America and Europe. And he was going to pull it out, like he was going to completely pull it until President Franklin D. Roosevelt stepped in and told him to go ahead and make it under any circumstances. So it is interesting seeing that, the president who at the time, they weren't in the war, they weren't a part of the war, but the president was trying to make a, I guess, cultural attack at Hitler, which, he was using, and that's another thing, like he was using film as a way to, get people interested and start the war.
No, I think it's 1940 is such a weird time too, honestly, in America, because obviously like America's still coming out of the Great Depression. So they're kind of like, I think like, I don't know, that to me is, I think, a big factor in sort of their attitude towards this war going on, is they're kind of like, we've still got our own problems. But like, it's such a weird time because there is this awareness of what's going on in Europe. And there is this question, I think, already of whether or not America will end up involved. But at the same time, they're very much like trying to still do their isolationist thing, which, back when America thought that we should keep to ourselves and not go into every country ever. But yeah, I just think that it's such an interesting time for this film to be made. And obviously too, like there is the element of like Chaplin as a British man in America making this movie, while his native country is already involved in the war. I don't know. One of the things about World War II that does interest me so much is sort of what Americans already knew about the Holocaust and what they knew about Hitler, and sort of were willing to sit by and like let happen. And there is all this interesting stuff about how Chaplin like did help a lot of people get out of Germany and out of Europe, during a lot of Jewish people like get out of there. He did work to do that. But he apparently like had friends who were in, Nazi occupied Europe who were sending him information about what was going on, like as he was making this movie. And I can't, obviously we've had movies that address political situations that are, contemporary, but I think it's like hard to grasp someone on the level that Charlie Chaplin was at, like, because he really was one of the leading people in Hollywood at the time, right? Like someone like that making a film that you know, like you said, like he directly goes after Hitler. Like there's no question about it here. He's not playing coy.
Yeah, and it is, it's interesting you brought that up because he was never Jewish. People assumed at the time that he was Jewish.
Okay, Germans thought Hitler thought he was Jewish, which is so funny that like
Hitler was Jewish.
well, yeah, well, we could talk about that. But no, like there was like Nazi stuff put out against Charlie Chaplin being like this Jewish man, and he's like, I'm literally not Jewish, but okay.
He did. It's like you said, he helped fund the escape of like thousands of Jewish refugees to places outside of Nazi-controlled Germany and other places. It's one of those things where it's like he not only like made the film as an attack, but he also like he backed it up in his humanitarianism, with everything he did, which makes it so interesting that he basically was exiled from America in the 50s.
I also think that it's really interesting that like for how clearly he is going after Hitler in this, I love the fact that like all the names are changed. Like, but I do think it's, you know, obviously like as someone in the time period watching it like contemporaneously, you would have every idea what was happening in it. But I think it is really interesting that like even now, this you know, much time later, it still like holds up. And I think the inclusion of like a Mussolini character in it is really interesting.
Oh yeah.
Because it just shows an awareness of like what was going on. And I feel like in the American education system, not to get on my like soapbox, but we're given a fairly simplistic view of World War II a lot, that doesn't lean into as much like things that were happening with Mussolini in Italy and things like that. So I think like that's a really interesting element to it as well. And I love the fact that though that we have this sort of, I don't know, what do y'all think about the fact that like he could have just made a movie that was more straight about this dictator character of Heinkel and like satirizing Hitler, but the inclusion of the other storyline, which like is, you know, about this Jewish barber and what he's going through, and the fact that there's like a romance plot line in it, I think is really fascinating.
I think he knew what he needed to do to appeal to the audiences, because I don't know if he could have necessarily completely hooked the audiences with this mockery about adenoid Hinkeloff. And I think that those plot points probably are what hooked the audience.
Yeah, I think that's like you said, like he was able to use those, the romance. He was able to use his silent comedy, his his voice for the first time ever, as well as all this stuff. And I think one of my favorite things about the movie is how it is. I mean, it is a full comedy, and it's comedy drama, but it's a lot of comedy, but it can shift from, they're in the streets hitting each other with, frying pans to like the next second he's about to get like hung in the middle of the street. And it's kind of has that like horror element to like you said, like reel people in with the romance, with the comedy, with the satire, but then also like really touch on and show the horrors that are happening, overseas that, people in the States probably aren't, too aware of at the time. And so it's just that kind of like recognition of like, this is what's happening. This is what, is going on. And he really used what he knew how to do best to convey this sort of like grim and dark message.
I do think, okay, that sequence that you mentioned where they're like, they've got this like physical comedy going on in the streets, like whatever. Like we're sort of seeing these Nazi soldiers as sort of like buffoons. And then suddenly they're literally stringing him up with a noose. I was like, it is one of the most interesting tonal shifts that I've seen in a film in a while that I thought was like done well. And the fact that like Charlie Chaplin, who is mostly known for being a comedian, could do that. And like, again, I don't want to like keep repeating myself, but the fact that this is his first full non-silent movie, I think like the fact that he's able to achieve all of that like really does speak to his talent.
Yeah, no, I agree.
And I
think it really shows kind of how he wasn't, because I know that shift from silent film to talkies were hard for a lot of people, and a lot of people just couldn't, make that transition well. And it is kind of interesting to see how like the best and one of the brightest in Hollywood at the time made that transition kind of seamlessly, and still was able to do everything that he was able to get across in his silent films, but kind of expand on it a little bit and bring in words and bring in voices and bring in all these different things. And I think, speaking on that, one of the funniest things, in my opinion, was, if you guys noticed, all of the leaders, they all spoke, and most of them spoke in like these awful like German accents or whatever.
Oh, yes.
But none of the stormtroopers ever spoke in any accents. All had American accents. It reminded me a lot of the death of Stalin, but one of those things that it's just kind of like it's one of those things that like even in the time you can sit there and be like, okay, these guys just sound like you and me. Like it's that kind of comedy that he was able to still get his point across while like expanding to not a different medium, but a different form of his medium.
Yeah, I guess luckily he is one of those actors who had a voice that like worked for talkies. Because I do think that's always interesting, is whenever you look at these stars of silent movies, and some of them just like did not sound good whenever they were allowed to talk for themselves, and like the way that killed some people's careers, I think, is so fascinating. So I guess like in some ways Chaplin was like lucky that like he just worked in talkies, but on the other hand, I do think like it speaks to his ability to adapt and to bring with him some of the elements that like had worked best in his films before that, while also combining them with these like newer elements. And I do think that, for a film made in 1940, there are elements of it that feel very modern. And especially like, to make the comparison again, I do think that this sort of combination of like humor and actual of the feeling still of real actual stakes is something that's similar to something like Jojo Rabbit, or even like something like Death of Stalin, where like you're able to combine that humor with something a bit more real sitting there as well. And that's not, I expected this to be more just straight comedy, to be honest. Like those scenes where they're coming to like search for them, where like the stormtroopers are coming to search for them, I was like, oh, this is legit tense.
Mm-hmm. And it's one of those things where it's like he used his comedy in a way to like convey that tenseness. And like in the scenes where they came to search for them, or in like in the scene where they did the coin and the pudding,
yes,
it's like, it's like, Charlie Chaplin sees the coin, he swallows it, he shakes it up, you hear the sound, everything. But it's like in that moment, you're like, oh, everyone's putting the coin on his, like, who's going to find out that it's on him? And then, I can't remember his name off the top of my head. Mr. Jackal. He kind of saw the coin and he was like, okay, like he understood that like, okay, I'm going to have to be the one to like die and sacrifice myself. And it was just kind of that like the whole scene is comedic, and then you get to him finding the coin, and it just, again, it's like Nicole said, that like tonal shift of like, okay, we're going from comedy to this guy's willingly wants to sacrifice his life to take out like this leader. Like that's how bad of a person and of a situation that this whole thing is, that he's willing to, give his life to take him out. And I think, it's like you said, it's those like little tonal shifts that you wouldn't think would work as well, but they really do work in this.
Absolutely. Awesome. All right. Does anyone have anything else that they want to say about this movie before we wrap up?
I will say, apparently Adolf Hitler found out that Chaplin was working on it, and he saw the film, and then I think he said it screened it again like the next day, and he like watched it like multiple times. And so I don't think anyone ever like figured out like what he thought about it, but apparently he logged down Letterboxd at least twice. So.
Yeah, wait, that is fascinating. I think he like watched it once and he was like, was that me in this? Did I forget that I made this movie? Let me watch it again. God,
and I think another one of the aspects that I think watching it this time, because in that like final speech, there are moments where he looks away from the camera, but for the most part, he's looking right at the camera. And it was this time when I was watching it, of course, he's saying it within the story. And of course, he's saying like this to the people, but it almost felt like he was saying it like about himself. Like, he is the one who wants to bring people together and to, in a sense, make people laugh and make people like feel better during these dark times, instead of, tearing people apart, which is what his, basically his counterpart. I mean, that whole story about their looks, I'm not going to get into his history as a person, but what he like presented to a culture was, on the side of good. It was, funny. It was all this. And then you've got someone who looks like him, born almost the same day, very similar. And he is like on the pure side of evil. And so.
And also an artist. I mean.
Yeah. It is weird. It's weird and uncanny.
But it is like, was almost like he was, it just was almost like he was speaking as himself more than he was speaking as character in the thing. He talks about like he doesn't want to be the face of this. He doesn't want to be the person that everyone kind of like runs to. He doesn't want to resemble this kind of person, but we all just have to come together so that we can put this to rest. And I just thought that was very fascinating. Again, it's that whole like direct attack, but it just is very fascinating that he, gives this speech on a pedestal that says liberty underneath it, and kind of just speaks to anyone watching it as like, this is what we need to do if this is going to be stopped.
Well, thank you so much for joining us in our 36th episode about The Great Dictator, and thank you, Jacob, for joining us as a guest on this episode.
Yes, we would love to hear from our listeners on social media and to hear what you think of The Great Dictator. Jacob, where can our listeners find you on social media?
I am on Twitter at tberry57, and I have a link tree in there where you can find all my stuff. It's really easy.
I feel like every time I guest on someone's show and I like do my little promo, I feel like I'm an ad for Linktree.
Well, no, that was like the last time you said that, I was like, oh, that seems so much easier.
Yeah.
So I just made one.
And I was inspired to make mine by Maggie. So
it's a whole
it's a beautiful circle.
This way.
Awesome. Well, you can find our podcast on social media at HGATM Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You can find Maggie over at Maggie of the Town, and you can find me at Nicole Ackman 16.
You can listen to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, the Airglue Media website, and of course, Audible. If you like what you hear, don't forget to leave us a rating on Apple Podcast or over on Podchaser. Every few episodes, we'll be reading our reviews, so be sure to leave us one if you would like to be featured.
Here's to wishing everyone has had a happy holiday season. Thank you for joining us for our second year of Friendsgiving, and we'll be back soon with another episode as we continue to look at period films from a history and film perspective.
You've been listening to Petticoats and Poppies,
History Girls at the Movies. This is the part where I talk like a robot.
Talk like a robot, talk like a robot, talk like a robot.
I don't, like, poor Albert who hears this every time.
Truly the best, though.